Hi. In my last video, I talked a bit about the importance of Christ's human response. Today, I want to dive a little bit deeper into that topic. As you've probably already figured out, one of my very favorite theologians is Thomas F. Torrance, or T.F. Torrance. If you want to watch a video where I talk about him a bit and his importance in my life, and also recommend a book of his, click the link up here. One of the major themes in Torrance's theology is what he calls the vicarious humanity of Christ. And as the name suggests, it's about all the ways in which the humanity that the Son of God took on was not just a fun exercise for him, but it was in a very important way for us, that it is, in a sense, even our humanity. Now, for some people, this might be a very new idea, so I want to try to outline just a little bit of why it's important. There are some theological traditions that are traditionally not comfortable with talking about Jesus being a substitute for us in any real way. There's usually a lot of uncomfortable feelings about Christ's death, or the idea that atonement needs to be worked out by the shedding of blood in some way. Those same traditions have a tendency to pretty exclusively talk about what Christ has done for us in terms of giving us an example for how we should live our lives. It's important that although that is common in some traditions, it is somewhat outside of the mainstream of what Christians have believed for the last 2,000 years. Most Christian theological traditions, though, want to talk about the idea that Jesus substitutes for us in some way, at least in his death. The idea being that our sin merits the result of death, and so what Jesus does is takes that death on his own shoulders and suffers it on our behalf and in our place. The idea is that we need a God who's willing to die for us. In fact, we need a God who actually does die for us because our death is simply not good enough. We're not always clear necessarily about how it happens, but there's a sense in which that God has done something in Christ's death for us, that it is something that overcomes our weakness and gives us something reliable in which to put our trust. Now, all of that is good and right and true, but it does tend to assume that the only thing we need Christ to do on our behalf and in our place is deal with the issue of death. And when we do that, there's this kind of silent assumption that that's the only thing that really needs to be substituted for, that in fact, once we have that, we have everything we need. By contrast, we read on nearly every page of the Bible that we don't just need atonement for our deaths, we need atonement for all the things that happen in our lives. And so unless we want to say that our lives are fine already, or at least that they can be fine once Jesus has taken care of death for us, which is certainly a semi-Pelagian view, which is the church has considered to be heresy, then we have to say that we not only need a God who dies for us, we also need a God who lives a real human life for us. So what does that mean for us? One of the things it does is it means that when we talk about the atonement that Christ has worked out for us, we can't just talk about his death. I once saw a hymnal that had a whole bunch of hymns that were about Good Friday and only very few about the resurrection. And there weren't that many about the human life of Christ up until that point. And I think that that betrays a theology of the hymnal that assumes that the only thing that really matters, the really important thing, is only Christ's death. By contrast, we need to think about the atonement as something that begins with the birth of Christ, or perhaps even as far back as the Annunciation, but that it continues through the life, death, resurrection, and even ascension of Christ. We really need to come to terms with the fact that either the life of Jesus is very important beyond just his death, or else it was really something that was just useless in itself, but only was there in order to provide a perfect sacrifice to the cross when the time came. And so unless we want to say that a major act of God was fundamentally useless, we need to come up with a way to think through this. Throughout the history of the church, there's been a long temptation to either legalism, where we act as if our salvation is dependent on us doing all the right things and living the right moral life, or else on Pelagianism, where we believe that Christ kind of opened the door to salvation, but then we have to work really hard to earn our way into it. And I think that part of that might be because we have a tendency to focus so much on what Christ did on the cross to the exclusion of what Christ did throughout his life. What I mean by that is that when we focus only on the cross, as if that's the only thing that has to do with our atonement, it becomes very difficult to answer the question of why it is that we should live lives of obedience. And if the only thing that matters is that there's a debt to be paid, and Christ on the cross paid that debt, then we have to wonder why it is we have to do anything at all. And I think that this is still a really big problem because antinomianism, or the view that there is no law whatsoever for the lives of Christians, and also the idea that what Jesus really did for our salvation was provide us a better way to live, are both alive and well in our world today. But if we start to think about atonement as being something that's the result of Christ's life every bit as much as it is of Christ's death, then that answers the question all at once. We live our lives of obedience because that's the result of following Jesus in the life of his obedience. His response is the only one that's perfect, the only one that's adequate, and so we follow him in that. Now, we may not always follow Christ adequately. In fact, we may not ever follow Christ adequately, but we put our trust in the fact that it's Christ's righteousness that really counts and not our own. And yet, at the same time, the only response that makes any sense for us at all is to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow Christ. So what this means is that when you look at your own righteousness and you realize that it just doesn't measure up, or when you find yourself stumbling through prayer, or when you find yourself falling short in a million different ways over the course of the day, that you don't have to worry about getting it perfect because Jesus has already done it in a way that is perfect, and then that is sufficient, and that all we need to do is put our trust in that and follow as best as we can. Well, that's all I have for this week. If you have a question or a topic you'd like me to take up, please send me an email at pastorstevic@gmail.com. If you found these videos to be interesting or engaging in some way, would you consider liking and sharing them on the various social media platforms? If you'd like, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel where these videos are posted, and it's youtube.com/tstevic1. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.